learning about Andrew Jackson and Manifest Destiny, and we were learning about how Americans started to move west into the new territory that they had gotten from the Louisiana Purchase. And with the spread of Americans west, we're also going to see the spread of slavery to the Southwest as well. And that's going to be one of the leading causes of the Civil War, as we're going to learn over the next couple of weeks. So today what we're looking at is the spread of slavery. And your assignment for today is, as you're watching this video lecture, I want you to write down 10 things that you learned about the development and spread of slavery in the United States. You can type these on a Google document, or you can write them down on paper and then take a picture of it and turn that in on Google Classroom. But either way, just a list of 10 things that you learn or that you found interesting as you listen to the lecture. But make sure that your 10 things are coming from the entire lecture, that you're not just grabbing them from the beginning and then stopping and not watching the whole thing. Okay, so let's talk about the Old South and put that into context to begin with. So cotton is king, meaning that in the South, the strength of slavery rested on cotton. You remember back to the market revolution with the invention of the cotton gin. The cotton gin made it easier to take the seeds out of the cotton, and so clean cotton was processed a lot quicker, which created a higher demand for slaves because now more cotton was being grown. So 3/4 of the world's cotton actually came from the southern United States. That means that the South was growing 75% of the cotton in the world before the Civil War. Most of this cotton would go to textile mills in the North, or also overseas to Great Britain, where they would use the cotton to then make textiles and clothing and other types of materials. Cotton represented America's biggest export. So it was the #1 way that America was making money, through exporting goods during this time. If you look at this map, one of these tiny green dots represents 200 slaves. So what that means is if you see these areas where it's really compacted and completely green, that means there's a lot of slaves in those areas. So if you look here, Louisiana and Mississippi, there's a large number of slaves right here along the Mississippi River because there's large cotton plantations here. That cotton could be shipped down the river to New Orleans, where it could then be shipped overseas to England or up north. You also have large slave population in South Carolina and Georgia along the coast. Remember, these were rice plantations. Then you also have large plantations in Virginia and North Carolina because these are large tobacco plantations. If you look at the slave population this way, in 1790, there were less than 700,000 slaves in the United States. By 1860, there are almost 4 million slaves in the United States. These are all located in the South, and this is right before the Civil War. 4 million slaves that are going to be living in the southern United States. It's important to remember, though, that even though there's a large number of slaves, most white Southerners in the South do not own slaves. In fact, 75% of whites in the South didn't own slaves. And that's because slaves were expensive, and so you had to be pretty wealthy in order to buy one of them. But even though most white people didn't own slaves, most of them supported slavery. Well, why would they support slavery even if they don't own slaves? And there's a couple reasons for that. Even though there's a few who speak out against the planter elite, the planter elite are large plantation owners. These are men who have thousands of acres of land and own, 100, 200 plus slaves. Well, even though some people speak out against slavery and against these men, most people are afraid of them because they control the economics, the politics in the South. And so a lot of people wouldn't speak up against them. A lot of people supported slavery because they are Southerners, so they feel like they have regional loyalty to the South. A lot of them are racist. They look down on slaves because they are Black, and a lot of them had family members who owned slaves, and so they didn't want to go against their own family. If we look at the number of slaves that are owned, most people are owning between 1 and maybe 4 slaves. What we're going to see is, though, the people who own 200 or more slaves are very few. About 250 people in the South by 1850 own 200 or more slaves. These are your really wealthy planters. These are the ones who have the thousands of acres. They make a ton of money, and they're the ones that are controlling the politics and stuff in the South. If we look at this map, the darker green are the more slaves. So again, you can see right here along the Mississippi River, right here in South Carolina and Georgia. And then the white are few slaves. So this is interesting. This is Randolph County right here in North Carolina. Randolph County did not have a lot of slaves because Randolph County was mainly inhabited by Quakers. Quakers were a religious group. They were very anti-slavery, and so Randolph County did not have a lot of slaves. And in fact, most people in Randolph County when the Civil War started didn't even support the Confederacy. If we look at this map, it shows the major crops in the South during this time period, green being cotton. So cotton's grown from South Carolina all the way to Texas. And again, that's going to be the major export of the United States. Tobacco is also a key crop, as well as rice, and then some sugarcane down here in the hotter areas of Louisiana. So Southern slave owners are committed to a hierarchy, meaning that the very wealthy plantation owners are at the top of the social pyramid, and then slaves are at the bottom of the social pyramid. And they're also committed to have an agrarian society, or a society that's based on farming and agriculture. So paternalism was a key feature of slavery. It's an idea that's ingrained into the slave society and into the South, and it's coming from the Latin word paternal, which means parent or father. So it's the idea that slave owners were parents to their slaves. And so slave owners would argue that slavery was a good thing because they clothed their slaves, they fed their slaves, they gave them shelter, they disciplined them when they needed it. And so they were saying that they were actually being like parents to their slaves. That was their defense for owning slaves. So the pro-slavery argument, really before 1800, a lot of people thought that slavery was bad, that it was a necessary evil. So even though that they were against slavery, they thought it was necessary to keep the economy running and run these large plantations. But after 1800, and as we get closer to the Civil War, people start to see slavery as a positive good, not just for the economy, but they said it was good for slaves as well, that slaves had jobs, that they were being fed and clothed and things like that. And so this was the argument amongst Southerners that slavery was a positive good. What we know, though, is slavery was not good for slaves. A lot of slaves were beaten without given a lot of mercy. They were forced to do excruciating labor and things like that. If we look at slavery in the law, slaves are considered property. They didn't have very many rights. They were not allowed to learn how to read or write because slave owners were afraid if slaves learned how to read or write, they would be able to communicate more and create slave rebellions and slave revolts and things like that. The idea that knowledge was power. Masters also controlled whether a slave married and then how they spent their free time. And so if a slave wanted to get married, that marriage had to be approved by the master. Any use of free time when a slave wasn't working, that had to be approved by the master, such as going to religious services or anything like that. Skip through a couple of this. So even though in the North that slavery had been abolished, there were no slaves in the North. The North wasn't immune to slavery. The North didn't need slaves because the North was mainly industrialized. The South was agricultural. The South needed slaves economically. There were very few large cities in the South, though. So in the North, a lot of their larger cities would be used to ship cotton and tobacco and other goods from the South because they had the bigger port cities. The South, because it was agricultural, produced less than 10% of the nation's manufactured goods. So most of the manufacturing, in fact, a large majority of that is happening in the North. So we can see the North is very industrial with factories. The South is still very agricultural with large plantations. There were some blacks in the South who were free blacks, meaning they weren't slaves. But even though they weren't slaves, they didn't really have a lot of freedoms in the South. They were allowed to own property. They could get married without anybody having a say in that. And they could not be bought or sold, which was really the key thing that made them different from slaves. However, free blacks were not allowed to own a firearm, so they couldn't own guns because that could be dangerous. Maybe they would shoot white people. They couldn't own a dog because Southerners were afraid they could train their dogs to attack white people, and they couldn't buy liquor or drink liquor because Southerners were afraid that if they got drunk, then they may create a fight or something like that. Free blacks couldn't testify in court they couldn't serve on juries, and they could not strike a white person, even if it was in self-defense. So if a white person walked up to a black person and smacked them, the black person couldn't do anything in retaliation without facing charges. If we look at the distribution of free blacks, most free blacks are going to live in the North where they have more freedoms. There's a large majority of free blacks in Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina as well, but most of them, again, are going to be in the upper South or in the North. If we look at the free black population by region, every black in the North was free, so 100% of the black population was free. If you look by state, you can see the more south that you get, the smaller that becomes. So for example, in Alabama, only 0.6% of the black population was free. It was only 0.2% in Texas. So what you can see by this is that the majority of black people in the South during this time are slaves. So there is resistance to slavery from slaves themselves. The most common form of resistance was called silent sabotage. This is where a slave would break tools or pretend to be sick, or they would just do poor work to try to halt the harvesting and production of crops, and therefore try to inflict some economic losses on their masters. Some less common but more serious forms of resistance would be trying to poison a master, arson, so where they would set a barn on fire or fields on fire or maybe the master's house on fire. And then less common would be armed assaults, where slaves would actually try to arm themselves and revolt against their slave masters. Some slaves did try to escape. They had to follow the North Star as their guide. It's estimated that about 1,000 slaves a year would escape to the North in order to find freedom, and they would do this on the Underground Railroad, which was led by Harriet Tubman, who I'm sure that all of you have learned about. But most of the slaves who are able to escape are leaving from the Upper South. So if we go back to this map, they're leaving from Virginia, Maryland, maybe North Carolina, because it was a lot easier to escape from the Upper South and get into the free North than if you were all the way down here in Alabama or Georgia, Mississippi. You would have to go all the way up here to freedom. And so while some slaves are escaping, if you lived in the Deep South, it was extremely hard to escape because you were so far away from free territory. Okay, so there was one big slave rebellion, Nat Turner's rebellion. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but Nat Turner led a rebellion in 1831. He ended up having about 80 followers that joined his rebellion, and they went on a rampage killing white women and children mainly because a lot of the men were out of town for a revival in a neighboring county. His goal, of course, was to earn his freedom. But what happens is, after a few weeks, he gets captured and he is executed. And what happens is it's really made the institution of slavery worse, as Virginia instituted harsher slave laws, as well as other southern states will do the same, to keep slaves in check and to make sure that they won't try to lead large-scale slave rebellions like this again. All right, so hopefully you've got your 10 things. If not, you can go back to some of the slides and get some more information. If you have any questions, just let me know.